Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador, and I would like to welcome also our panelists joining us online. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to host this very important panel discussion because, ladies and gentlemen, we are no longer living in merely interesting times. We are experiencing challenging times, which can be paralleled with the Oscar-winning movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Challenging times require the building of systemic resilience to protect, to react and recover from a variety of threats. So we can expect to see more of these emerging threats on the eastern flank, but also well beyond. And it is very likely that they will characterize the coming decades of the 21st century. We can already see and anticipate a constantly evolving landscape of overlapping, crisscrossing threats: military, economic, environmental, and social. This includes multidimensional and multiplied challenges and increasingly sophisticated and numerous hybrid terrorist and cyber threats. And so these threats are already visible with the Russian war in Ukraine, as well as the deep infiltration of Russian hybrid tactics into European territory and networks, with the looming threat from China, in the great resurgence of strategic competition among states, in the further development of relatively new domains that generate not only progress but also threats, such as cyberspace and space, in the comprehensive panoramic digital transformation, pandemic threats, climate change, and the disruption of supply chains. And all this require a strategic approach to building systemic resilience, which is also reinforced through cyber resilience, so a response, preparedness, and proactive scenario planning to threats originating from cyberspace. And I would like to start a discussion accordingly to the ladies' first rule, to have an overview of how the resilience concept and strategies have evolved over the years, and then turn to gentlemen on the panel with some other concrete questions. And finally, I hope we will conclude with some actionable recommendations which can be applied to countering Russian hybrid threats on the eastern flank. So first question would go to Marina Miron. Based on your research, why has our understanding of systemic and cyber resilience against hybrid threats increased rapidly over the last few years? And furthermore, what unique challenges do hybrid threats pose to the integrity of our democratic institutions, resilience, military strategies, and defense strategies in this era of modern strategic competition? The air is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Good day, everyone. Well, it's quite a difficult question to answer, so I'll have to break it down. And the first thing I wanted to say is the current overflow in terms of terminology, what we understand as hybrid threats. NATO's own documents now refer to hybrid threats, whereas previously we were talking about sub-threshold threats. So first we need to get an appreciation of what we're talking about, what the problem here is. And the idea is that NATO as a military alliance has mostly military tools at its disposal to respond to threats, and we all know about Article 5. Now, we run into problems when we're talking about those so-called hybrid and sub-threshold threats, which include threats that would not necessarily trigger the collective defense, meaning threats in cyberspace, so cyber attacks, cyber espionage, disinformation campaigns. So this is one portion of threats that we're facing, and they are conducted often in conjunction with the use of intelligence services for psychological operations and human operations, human intelligence in physical space. Then we have another category of threats where we have a military component, and we have seen that being used in Ukraine and the Donbass since 2014, where you cannot actually, to whom this component might belong and who might be interested in inserting that component. However, there is no clear attribution and there is no clear response. So we have this broad spectrum of different threats which wouldn't necessarily trigger Article 5. They are all in different domains, and often they are state-sponsored, but we also have sympathetic groups to the state or to the state's cause participating. And we also have instances of several states cooperating. For instance, the recent cyber espionage by Russian and Iranian hackers working in tandem. So this amplifies their efforts. So that is more or less the threat landscape and what we understand as hybrid threats. Now, NATO has been trying to address this problem as an alliance, and there is also a Center of Excellence countering hybrid threats, which looks into ways to mitigate such threats. However, the response so far has been more reactive rather than proactive. Yes, as far as military threats are concerned and deterring military threats, it is much easier to coordinate and to act. And one example being the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics and in Poland in order to deter a potential Russian military incursion on the eastern flank. However, in conjunction with deterring a military incursion, we have a much bigger and wider problem when it comes to cyberspace. And this is something I would like to focus on because this is the topic of our conference here. And so the response in cyberspace has been much more difficult with countries like the UK thinking about ethical and legal implications of how do you respond to a cyber attack. Does it ever cross the threshold of warranting a kinetic response? So that has been on the table, that option for a while, without kind of finding a proper ethical and legal solution. When would a cyber attack warrant such a response? And if not, how do we respond to cyber attacks? So mostly the Alliance has been investing in cyber defenses. So in terms of defense capabilities, specifically working with the Baltics, who have great experience in countering Russian cyber attacks, and now Ukraine, which has been facing Russian cyber activities, especially since 2014 onwards. And we remember Sandworm linked to the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, remember the NotPetya attack. And so those are some of the examples where cooperation with actors who have been the target of such cyber attacks and the information sharing, intelligence sharing will be very important. However, it has also some obstacles because as an alliance, there is a way to create a strategy and discuss these issues with heads of states and defense ministers. However, when it comes to implementation of these strategies, there is still the legal problem of each NATO member having its own ideas and its own rules of engagement, and in how far these strategies, cyber defense strategies, are implemented depends on each member. So that makes it very difficult to have a uniform approach across the entire alliance when it comes to preventing, in the first place, cyber technical attacks. This will necessitate closer cooperation with the private sector, and we know that the attacking parties often leverage private actors in order to be able to capitalize on the innovation that the private sector is making, that the governments simply cannot afford because they do not have that R&D capacity. And so in the case of NATO, it would also be important to ensure the unity of effort on the one hand and closer cooperation with the private sector, as well as increased information and intelligence sharing and more transparency between member states. And on the level of each member state, again, there needs to be closer cooperation with civilian agencies in order to be able to prevent such threats in terms of cybersecurity. And that is kind of the cyber technical bit of this problem is perhaps an easier problem to address and an easier threat to anticipate. And we also have to think about the kind of the gray zone and third parties, such as brokers who sell zero-day exploits. So this goes into the law enforcement area, and this is another thing that needs to be addressed in order for the alliance and the members of the alliance to gain awareness of potential exploits as early as possible without having such intermediaries selling the exploits to the highest bidder. The other part of the problem is, of course, what we've heard in the past quite a lot, information and disinformation, and how specifically Russia and, of course, China to a certain degree are trying to influence this particular space. And it has been increasing over the past years, the disinformation campaigns, with a proliferation of different mediums to transmit information. We're becoming more and more vulnerable when it comes to disinformation. And often we have to distinguish between disinformation, which is information being wrong information, which the person or the system spreading it knows that it's wrong, so it's not factual, so that is disinformation. But we also have misinformation, which is much more nuanced. That means if somebody, a bot, posts something controversial on Twitter that is not factually right, there might be useful idiots who just repost it without knowing that this information is indeed not true, and the growth of the noise created by that is exponential. And private agencies have taken steps in countering disinformation. We also have the likes of Bellingcat, who are conducting more thorough investigations when it comes to operations in the gray zone, so the hybrid operations specifically by Russia. However, it seems like this exercise is disjointed, so there is no unifying structure. Rather, you have several actors acting on their own accord in order to address this problem, and I'm sure that there is not much public awareness as far as where we can go in order to do a fact check. We're just overwhelmed with this amount of information and with the amount of noise, and especially with the advent of generative AI and the likes of ChatGPT. This will be likely increasing. Of course, we can capitalize on AI for this purpose in order to potentially help filter out disinformation and misinformation and debunk it and offer an alternative version to the audiences. However, the proliferation of such information will increase exponentially, make it much more difficult for us to counteract it. And the problem is that we're facing now is largely the fact that there is no unified strategy per se in terms of dealing with this, and the response seems to be post factum, meaning that once that disinformation is out there, it takes time to firstly discover it, secondly to put it up somewhere on the website and debunk and say, well, this is actually not factual, and here are the sources which offer an alternative version and which are supported by facts. And public awareness.
Thank you, Marina. This was very comprehensive, and we'll definitely discuss it later on in more in-depth way also with Ambassador Szatkowski regarding the points you made about NATO and also innovation. Now I would like to turn to Melissa Hathaway. Melissa, given the increasing complexity of hybrid threats, how have national security strategies and institutions, particularly in the US, evolved to ensure resilience against these hybrid threats? Could you provide some insights using the evolution of cybersecurity as an example, since you were engaged in this topic for many years now?
Thank you, Isa. It's great to see you and be with you all virtually. I think the most important evolution that's happened over the last decade is we've really stopped talking about cybersecurity, cyber defense, and it's now about digital resilience. And you'll see that evolution in the new US cybersecurity strategy and even in the US national security strategy, the importance of resilience, the importance of a secure software supply chain, that our companies and our critical infrastructures need to be thinking about how they can become more resilient and working in partnership with the government. So the first change is from really cybersecurity to digital resilience and the resilience of our critical infrastructures and services. I think the second thing is, while we've discussed it for decades of the importance of a private-public partnership, you're finally seeing it operationalized at a scale that is important, and the recognition that the private sector really is going to be the delivering the resilience, and the private sector are the first responders to when we have an incident. So within the United States, in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, you're seeing a weekly, if not more often than that, discussion of the known exploited vulnerabilities database. I get an alert probably 2 or 3 times a week with new vulnerabilities that they want both government and industry to be witting of and to address immediately. In the last 2 weeks, that would have been the MOVE-IT vulnerability, but you're seeing that as one area of increased information exchange. The second area in the United States is the National Security Agency stood up the Commercial Collaboration Center, where the government and industry are sitting side by side in an unclassified environment, talking about the threat, what the private sector is seeing, what the government is seeing, and they're issuing joint alerts. So when you see an advisory coming out of the United States, whether it's CISA or the National Security Agency or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they're also giving credit to the industry partners who have helped provide information on those alerts. And of course, those all go out globally, so it's a resource for all of our allies and partners. A third area that we started to do over the last 2+ years as part of our persistent engagement with allies is through the U.S. Cyber Command. We're conducting these missions that are called Hunt Forward, where an ally like Poland or an ally like Albania most recently invites us into their networks and infrastructures to hunt for malicious activity, for pre-positioned malicious software. And we help teach those institutions or organizations how to remove the malicious software, how to make their networks more resilient. And then we expose those malicious activities in these advisories so that everybody can have a better defensive posture. We also, I would say, sticking with the private sector, I think it's really important to note that that Ukraine is standing more resilient only because of the private sector support. Starlink is giving them the commercial availability. Google and Microsoft moved all of their information to the cloud. Microsoft, ESET, ESET, CrowdStrike, Google are all providing active defense and overall helping with the cybersecurity and defensive posture. And so we have to recognize that, again, the private sector is the first responders, and we need to recognize and figure out how we can partner with them more effectively in government. And then finally, I think we're seeing such an active third-party environment, whether that's and specifically in the United States, the ransomware gangs, but in other areas, it's the distributed denial of service, again, from third-party actors. And the United States helped stand up the ransomware task force, which I think has over 40 countries now participating in it. We as partners all have to actively dismantle these ransomware gangs and these whether you call them vigilantes like KillNet or these hacktivists or whoever is working on behalf of the state. We need to start dismantling these networks and treat them like terrorists, because they are terrorizing our schools, our hospitals, our provinces, and really causing a fair amount of social instability. But I'll stop there. Those are some of the activities that are happening here in the United States. Resilience first, collective defense second, and it's all of nation, but all of partners. We have to have the private sector helping us and perhaps leading us. Thank you, Isa.
Thank you, Melissa. And now I would like to ask Hannah Smith about the role of Organization for Security and Cooperation. It is perceived by its members as the right framework with suitable tools to address hybrid threats. So how do you tackle the complexity of hybrid and information cyber threats which blur the lines between war and peace in the international security environment, especially after February 24th, when one of the members is regularly and brutally using conventional and hybrid threats toolbox and tactics. So what's the role for your organization nowadays in these hybrid threats? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and good afternoon to everybody there in the audience and also my fellow panelists. I'm very honored to be part of this conference, as well as also it's a delight that OSCE has been asked to participate in this conference. Before I continue, I have to say that a disclaimer that the approach that I have and what I say is through my own expertise and does not subscribe to OSCE's official stance in any way. So all the mistakes, whatever there relating to OSCE is then on me. That is nowadays what I have to say. And the reason starting to answer the question is the fact that OSCE is not like-minded organization. When it comes to building resilience, discussing threats, doing situational awareness assessment, scenario buildings, today, when I work now at the OSCE, I realize that in a non-like-minded organization, this is very difficult, and how easy it was when I used to work at the hybrid COE, which is kind of like-minded, that EU and NATO countries are a part of the hybrid COE, intergovernmental. So we used to talk about it there, that, oh, these are difficult and let's see how we can find. Now when I work at the OSCE, I realized, right, actually, being in a like-minded organization, yes, different opinions, different ways of looking at it, but the basic assessment on situational awareness is much closer to each other. Having said that, OSCE is still a very interesting organization because it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest at least, if not the only one, who has a strong, comprehensive approach on security. Exactly what we have started to talk about when we have started to talk about the hybrid threat activity, hybrid threats as a threat to mostly the democratic world from the authoritarian side. That's specifically the way how hybrid COE talks about the hybrid threats. So then you need the comprehensive approach. And OSCE has that. It has three different dimensions. It has the political military, more kind of a hard security side, the economic and environmental dimension, and then the human dimension, which has legal reforms, rule of law, information security, election aspects, all of it. So looking at it very comprehensively, it's already given some added value. What OSCE cannot, because it's a consensus organization, and as mentioned, not all members are on the same page, and actually some members are in strong violation of international law and even the commitments they themselves have signed into. So therefore, when we're talking about kind of threat assessments, let's put it that way. I mean, in the OSCE, perhaps it's problems and challenges instead of fully threats, but from the security perspective, there is a certain commonness in it, and there is a need to mitigate the security challenges. Observation now, I'm speaking the OSCE language, not necessarily security threats, but security challenges. So in the OSCE level, we're talking about very kind of general, sometimes very technical, and then a strategic level. But the tactical side is something that is not talked about it so much. How OSCE can, though, tackle, and why its participating states find the platform rather useful, the organization, is the fact that because of this comprehensive security approach, there is also a sectoral approach. So not to lose the bigger picture, but to target sectors like cyber, like information, like critical infrastructure. So there is an energy or water management, things like that. So you actually have a sectoral approach. Something that is also rather unique is the fact that in OSCE context, you take local, national, and international levels. This is also very important to remember when kind of starting to assess, thinking about tackling any kind of security threats, that you need to include that. We heard in a previous speech that private sector is seen as kind of the first respondents, but sometimes, depending, of course, on what's happening and what type of activity we are talking about, a local level is in fact the first respondent. And if that is not concentrated very much, then we already lose some time when problems happen. And final point is about attitude. And the attitude is the fact that, and this comes to cybersecurity, we need to be able to talk about already cybersecurity in the way that this is a new normal. It is happening, the threats are there, and how we perhaps challenge, the bigger setting. What are kind of our ways of looking at the cyber space threats? Because we're still talking about like it would be something new, and it has been among us for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, what are the most notable preventive and responsive strategies and measures that have been developed so far by NATO? Marina mentioned that NATO should be more proactive and has more collaborative approach. Can you elaborate on what measures are NATO making in that respect of hybrid threats and building the resilience?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me once again. It's an honor. I mean, it's a sort of truth known to everybody that NATO has been facing from its foundation threats and across the entire spectrum of escalation, ranging from those which are hardly attributable up to nuclear warfare. Indeed, recently the concept of a hybrid warfare has gained prominence, starting from 2014, but it's not really a novelty. When we look, for instance, into the issue of the green men, which has been very fashionable some almost 10 years ago, we can date back some of those activities centuries ago. I mean, in the case of Poland, in the 20s, we were facing very similar phenomena that Ukraine was exposed to prior to 2022. But the problem with those is, as it was mentioned before, that they are very difficult to attribute. That therefore, the responsibility to deal with them rests mostly through the concept of resilience, which again is anchored in the Article 3 of the Washington Treaty. Article 3, which basically stipulates that it's first of all our own responsibility to develop our own capacity to respond. And of course there might be self-help, there might be some forms of mutual cooperation, and that can be somehow governed or guided by NATO principles, to which I will quickly return. But I mean, NATO as an organization can also provide some added value, but this is sort of a cherry on the cake. And then when it comes to this cherry on the cake, there's been a new strategy developed in 2015. This strategy has put into place capabilities like counter-hybrid support teams, and when it comes to examples, I can mention they've been fielded twice. Once in Montenegro to respond to some attempts to destabilize the country politically. In Lithuania, it was the counter-hybrid support team was deployed in order to help the Lithuanian government respond to the illegal migration flow that was basically part of a hybrid activity. In the latter case, there was, I would say, the result has been somewhat debatable. I mean, there's been some conclusions that we have to look into how we can assist one another in this situation. Now, maybe going to the theme of this conference, of course, cyber is an important aspect of hybrid spectrum. There's been some work on developing cyber incident support capacities. We've also been developing the contribution of cyber capabilities into the overall deterrence and defense posture. There's been some new decisions that were taken this year. Of course, I cannot talk about them in detail. But we also have to mention resilience to hybrid activities as part of an assistance to classic military operations, and which has been very much at the core of NATO's approach to resilience since the beginning. Basically, NATO was very strong in terms of resilience of its members in the Cold War, and had an almost like a regulatory network. Now, then that concept dissipated in the 90s as NATO moved its focus out from the defense of its territory. And was looking outwardly, and it's been sort of reinstated into NATO's policies recently. It's built around mostly three functions. This is basically this is the continuity of government. Of course, we have to have. I mean, command control is basically critical both in the military but also in the political realm of activities. This is clear. This is provision of services both to population but also to the military, because military will rely in a case of collective defense. Military will rely on provision of sort of civilian critical services like transport, like food supplies, water supplies. There's medical capacity that has to be sufficient for civilians, but also for the military. There's deconfliction of transport routes and so on and so on. Yeah, so this is critical services for population, but also civil support for military operations. These are these three critical areas. And when it comes to governance structures, that has been reformed, the core of the decision-making system is the Resilience Committee, which is a new body within the alliance. It sort of reports to, of course, to North Atlantic Council, where the ambassadors sit. But it's this main expert body within the alliance that is dealing and also developing standards like 7 baseline requirements, which basically come out of those 3 functions.
Yeah, and I believe that it will also be followed up by some measures to assess whether nations are making progress in terms of resilience. And what is also important, and we spoke about it during the previous panel, is Diana, which is also like trying to help in tackling some resilience issues. We unfortunately won't be able to explore it more today because we are running out of the time. So thank you for your responses. And now I would like to turn to Victor Zora, last but not least. Victor, could you please share with us how Ukraine prepare itself to face this escalating challenge in terms of increasing speed, scale, and intensity of hybrid threats, and what lessons should your allies learn from your experience? Please, the air is yours.
Thank you, Isabella, and thank you for having me. I wish I were in Katowice on the stage, but my colleagues from CCC are in the audience. First of all, we should clearly understand that cyber aggression began in 2014 with the attack on the Central Election Commission, and there were very destructive attacks on Ukrainian power grid and famous NotPetya attack and many others, and that happened immediately after the annexation of Crimea. So we have these 8 years before the full-scale invasion to get prepared, and that was reached through a number of international technical assistance projects, through reform in cybersecurity field that we had in Ukraine, through the preparation and the adoption of new legislation, through building capacities, through training people and preparing workforces, through enhancing information exchange, and that was accelerated in the last 2 years, foreseeing the upcoming full-scale aggression, in which the cyber component plays a huge role. From the lessons learned, of course, first of all, I would say that the aggressor is focusing is on civilian infrastructure. He targets civilian targets, and of course, Ukraine is not only a country in the focus of Russia's offensive cyber units, but also our allies. However, the aggressor hasn't reached their strategic goals in this component, and now it converts to be more supportive to their kinetic operations, sometimes being used for subversion, for influence operation, and of course seeking for opportunities to disrupt Ukrainian communications, electronic services, and data and information infrastructure. And of course, the great role of our cyber resilience is owned by the volunteers, by public and private partnership, and in this case, I would perhaps disagree with Melissa. I don't want to detract the role of private companies. Their assistance and help was enormous, but at the same time, I wouldn't detract the role of volunteers, of Ukrainian cyber defenders, and of course of our allies, governments who offered their support. And we have this unique cooperation with many stakeholders, and of course our cyber resilience is maintained due to threat intelligence sharing, assisting in cloud environments, in of course, in communication, Starlinks were mentioned, etc., etc. But again, the people are in the center of countering Russian cyber aggression, and that's what I would like to recommend in terms of building cyber reserve, in terms of training people, in terms of improving cooperation, having joint cyber exercises and other forms of preparations and getting ready to escalation in cyber aggression, and of course sharing important information on threats, on indicators of compromise, and learning the tactics and techniques of an aggressor in order to help public sector organizations and private business to get prepared to potential threats, which for sure will evolve in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. It will serve as a recommendation for us all. Thank you for that. Thank you to our panelists, and I would like to invite you for the next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Isabella.